I'll begin my remarks on the Ukraine by noting that just before this program began, I was watching a presentation by Jeffrey Sachs. He was speaking to a Chilean audience. And Jeffrey Sachs, as many of you know, is a very respected economist, and he's been very active on the international scene since his late 20s. He was actually, I think, for worse, not for better. He was a major advisor to Boris Yeltsin beginning in 1992. And in my opinion, but that's not for now, he is significantly culpable for the catastrophe that ensued in Russia under Yeltsin's leadership, a catastrophe of a magnitude such that you could say Yeltsin, with the advice of Jeffrey Sachs, or I should say Jeffrey Sachs, through Yeltsin, was singularly responsible for bringing Vladimir Putin into power. But that's another time and another place. I mentioned Jeffrey Sachs because the question of Ukraine obviously came up during his presentation, and I was surprised, but also, if I can use the word, I was gratified to hear that he said, and now I think I'm quoting him verbatim, but you all can check. All you have to do is go to YouTube and enter Jeffrey Sachs, Chile. He said, I think I'm quoting him verbatim, he said, the US caused the war in Ukraine. He didn't limit himself to saying the US provoked the war. He said the US caused the war in Ukraine. And for those of you who follow these debates, these discussions, it's a in my opinion, it's a critical distinction because many people, obviously not a majority, but a significant number of people have been willing to say that the US and NATO, the US provoked the war. However, they stop short of saying the US caused the war, but instead say, notwithstanding the provocations by the US and NATO, notwithstanding the provocations, they say that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was criminal. And I'm not aware of anyone except for myself, and I think Sachs comes pretty close when he says caused the war. My position has been from day one of the war that Russia had the right to attack, but, and it's not a big but it's a but. There's a difference between having a right and exercising that right. And I have said from the beginning, Russia had the right to attack. However, I cannot say with any kind of certainty that it was a wise or a prudent thing to attack. To me, those are separate questions. But on the, let's call it on the moral question, it's my view they had the right to attack. Now, what I would like to do in this few minutes that we're going to talk about the Ukraine and then hearing from you is to make an analogy and then see how you react to it. Uh, my area of professional expertise is the Israel-Palestine conflict, and so I'm going to make a comparison with that conflict, or an analogy. So, a lot of you will not remember for reasons of age, but the critical turning point in the Israel-Palestine conflict came in 1967, the 1967 war, sometimes called the Six-Day War, but we'll just call it the June 1967 war. Now, there's no question, as a factual matter, that Israel fired the first shot. Israel denied it for about a week that it fired the first shot, but after about a week or 2 weeks, I can't remember now with precision, Israel frankly admitted, because the evidence was overwhelming, that they fired the first shot. However, they claimed that they had a right to launch the attack on the neighboring Arab countries, they being Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. And their argument went something like this. Abu Abin, who was the foreign minister of Israel at the time, in his memoir, he had a famous chapter called "To Live or to Die." To live or to die. And in this chapter, he builds up a scenario such that Israel had no choice. So he says, number one, that Egypt had sealed the Straits of Tiran. That's a waterway that led to a port in Israel's south. And he said, in his famous metaphor, he said, after the sealing of the Straits of Tiran, Israel was now breathing with one lung. Then he said, Egypt had moved approximately 100,000 troops into the Sinai, the Egyptian Sinai, and they were poised to attack. And then he said, at the end of May, Egypt signed a joint agreement with Jordan, an alliance aimed at Israel. So he takes this accumulation of facts. Israel is breathing with one lung. Egypt is poised to attack. It has 100,000 troops in the Sinai. At the end of May, an agreement is struck between Egypt and Jordan. A defense pact is struck between them. And he says, when you take this accumulation of facts, that Israel had no option but to attack. And it fired the first shot. Now, as it turned out, it's easy to demonstrate that all of the claims Israel made were flat out false. But that's not going to concern me now. I've extensively documented it in various publications, as have many, many other historians, in particular Israeli historians, but that's not going to concern me now. My point is, were the facts true that Israel was facing a to live or to die situation? Were those facts true? Then it would seem to me that Israel would have a case for firing the first shot. In fact, if you go back and look at the record, very few people immediately after the war, when the facts were not yet known, except everybody knew Israel launched the attack that fired the first shot, very few people were willing to criticize Israel because the facts seemed to convey as Abba Eban put it, or a do or die situation. So I would say that in the case of Russia and Ukraine, the facts are true. Those facts being, number one, from 1989, which is not a short time ago at this point. Quite a few people on the screen now were not even born in 1989. From 1989, every Russian leader, bar none, was calling for a halt to NATO expansion, or was told, this was at the very beginning, that, or was promised that there would not be a NATO expansion. That fact, to me, you can go through all the technicalities of whether it was a verbal agreement, whether it was a written agreement, what the archives show. That, to me, is of secondary importance. It was clear from the get-go, beginning with Gorbachev in 1989, that the Russians understood there would not be a NATO expansion. And from the moment the NATO expansion began, the Russians were constantly remonstrating to stop the NATO expansion. Number two, after the, let's just call it, because I don't want to get into a quarrel on semantics, after the non-constitutional change of government in Ukraine in 2014, after that non-constitutional change of government in Ukraine in 2014, a significant part of the Ukrainian government, formal and informal, was now composed of representatives of Nazi or far-right organizations which were fanatically anti-Russian. Now, I'm not going to go into the percentages, but in my opinion, it's not open to debate that, because it's a factual matter, that critical security and military positions in the government after the unconstitutional change of government belong to far-right Nazi parties. That's fact number two. Fact number three was Russia made clear that the expansion of NATO to Georgia and Ukraine would be red lines for them. In particular, with Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine share about 1,000-mile border. I can't remember now if it's 1,000, I think it's 900-mile border. And there was significant concern about US NATO missiles being placed along that border within 5 minutes distance of key Russian cities. Beyond that, there was the attempts again by Russia at the end of December 2021, going into February 2022, of proposing various diplomatic settlements of the conflict. And the steady response of the NATO head, Jens Stoltenberg, to every proposal that was made by Russia, Stoltenberg replied, and here I'll give you as close as I can to a verbatim statement. He said, everything between NATO and any other government is our business, not yours. And the Russians made two proposals, one to NATO and one directly to the US. And the response by NATO was, we will not promise that missiles will not be stationed in Ukraine. They said, we reserve the right to station defensive missiles. Now, when you're within 5 minutes of Russia's major cities, the distinction between offensive and defensive missiles, I think, but I'm not a military person, but I think any reasonable person would say that distinction is meaningless. And secondly, NATO responded that we will station troops in Ukraine, not on a permanent basis, but on a rolling basis. That means we'll station some troops, then replace them with other troops, then replace them with other troops. But the bottom line is clear. There will be NATO missiles and NATO troops stationed in Ukraine. Now, I'll save for the last point of the comparison. And the last point of the comparison is this. When Abin made his speeches at the UN, Abba Abin, the Israeli foreign minister, when he made his speeches, he kept referring back to the Nazi Holocaust and the extermination of between 5 and 6 million Jews. And he was saying that Israel now faces another Holocaust. So that served as the backdrop. For his defense of Israel to launch the attack. Now, as I said, if you go through the evidence, everything Abba Abin said about the blockade of the Straits of Tiran, about the Egyptian troops in the Sinai, about the pact with Jordan, all of it was nonsense. However, it served to make a compelling case. And I say, just as Israel had the right to invoke the backdrop of the Nazi Holocaust, Russia has the right to invoke the fact that 27 million, that's the current number, 27 million Soviet people were exterminated during World War II. Russia on the east, Germany on the Eastern Front fought a war of extermination. They wanted to create what they called Lebensraum, living space for Germans, an expanding German population. And so they proceeded to engage in a war of annihilation, a war of extermination. And the Soviet people suffered a loss, not quite the magnitude of the Nazi Holocaust directed at Jews, but certainly of a magnitude which, in my opinion, justified its right to say, sorry, Mr. Stoltenberg, but stationing missiles in Ukraine on our border, which in a matter of time almost certainly would be nuclear-tipped missiles, it is our business. It is our business. And in light of that, I believe they had the right to attack. Should they have? I don't know. I'm not a military person, but I don't accept the argument because I do not believe it makes logical sense. I do not accept the argument that, yes, it's true, Russia provoked. Yes, it's true, Russia provoked. Yes, it's true, Russia provoked. But then after listing the 10,000 Russian provocations, we then hear, but the invasion was criminal. That doesn't make sense to me. That doesn't compute. Unless you can show me a significant option, a significant non-violent diplomatic option that Russia had but didn't exercise. If you can show me a significant option that Russia had but didn't exercise, then of course my argument is not compelling. But so far as I could tell, all I heard was Russia needed to give more time to diplomacy, more time to diplomacy. I'm thinking to myself, more time to diplomacy? I should think more than 30 years, 3 decades is an awful lot of time. 3 decades, that's an awful lot of time. And if they miss one possible option, one tiny option, which I don't even know what it is, but if they missed it, I find it far-fetched in the extreme, given that track record that the US or NATO would have agreed to it. I see no basis for that fact. The US was determined with NATO. They were determined to subordinate Russia, to put Russia in a position that it would have to accept any ultimatum coming from the US and NATO, or else face military might on its border. And there is no way, in my opinion, that any offer the Russians made, short of surrender, would have evoked a positive reaction from the West. I see no evidence of that. Okay, now fire away and tell me everything I said that was wrong.